Good. Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we're just about ready to get started. My name's Maureen Conway. I'm Vice President for Policy Programs here at the Aspen Institute and Executive Director of our Economic Opportunities Program. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all here today for our conversation about the Fight for 15, a right wage for working America. And today we're going to have a conversation in three parts, actually. So first I'm going to spend some time talking with David about the book that he just wrote and what's going on sort of in the world of improving the situation for workers and how workers are participating in that. And then we actually have a great opportunity to hear from people who are on the front lines of doing this, people for whom these issues are the most immediate and who are really actively trying to create change in their own workplaces. And then we're going to have a conversation with all of you. So that's kind of our agenda of things. There will be a little bit of shuffling of chairs and moving of tables at certain points, but you can just take a little opportunity to stretch maybe, and we'll move on as fast as we can. Okay, so that's the first part of my logistics remarks. The second part of my logistics remarks, do please silence your phones. But do please tweet. Our hashtag is TalkGoodJobs. And I should also mention when we do the Q&A, we are live streaming and recording the event, and so we will be passing mics, and if you do, please use them when you ask a question. That is super helpful. Okay, and we're going to try to conclude the Q&A just a couple of minutes before 1:30 so that you have time to buy books. David will be signing them, as well as the workers whose experiences are referenced in this book will also sign the book if you like. So that's a great opportunity. So we hope that you will all avail yourself of that. Okay, so I just want to say a few words to get started in terms of framing the conversation. In the Economic Opportunities Program, we spend a lot of time thinking about how people can connect to work, and that's because work is the source of opportunity in the U.S. Work is generally our answer to the question of poverty. How do you get out of poverty? You get yourself a job and you work your way out of poverty. We structure policies to encourage work. We have everything from cash assistance for single parents to food stamps that has work requirements. Our largest source of social assistance is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which by definition requires work. So work is fairly central, and we have this idea that if we connect people to work and if people can build a work experience, that they will be able to get to a job where they can support themselves and hopefully a small family without reliance on public assistance. And unfortunately, we have averted our eyes from the growing phenomena of poverty wage work and the fact that scenario, that trajectory, just is not possible for large and growing numbers of people. Recently, these issues have come to the fore. We've had the issue of inequality with things like Thomas Piketty's tome, Capital in the 21st Century, becoming a bestseller, and Occupy Wall Street really put the issues of inequality on the map. They've grabbed the headlines. The U.S. has experienced tremendous economic growth over the past several decades, but the income and wealth resulting from that growth has accrued to a relative few. Some might argue that the inequality is okay. It's okay as long as everybody has an equal chance, but we know that that's not true. We know that economic mobility is low, much lower in the U.S. than in many other European countries, and it's been that way for a long time. We know that the circumstances of your birth and often associated with your zip code are all too determinative of what your outcomes in life might be. We also know that some might say that it's okay if we have inequality as long as people can earn a living from work. And as I was mentioning earlier, we know that that is also not true, that so much of work now does not support the basics that people need to get by. I do need to take a pause here because we do have, I will say, we had some great economic news in the last week. We finally after a long period of wage stagnation, saw incomes rise, and in particular among middle and lower income households. So that was great news, but it's not enough because they still are earning less than what they earned before the recession. They still are not earning enough to even support themselves, much less a family. So we're in a grave situation. And I just, in terms of thinking about what does this mean for ourselves and our future, one of the statistics that really stuck with me is the fact that over half of public school students now receive free and reduced price meals, right? So over half of public school students qualify. This does not bode well for our future to have so many children growing up in poverty and in limited circumstances. And it's not because their parents don't work. It's because their parents don't earn enough to even buy food. So today we're talking about the Fight for 15 and what do we do to raise wages. And before we start, it's worth noting a few things about who's earning $15 or less. So first of all, 42% of workers earn less than $15 an hour. I'll give a shout out to the National Employment Law Project who did a study showing that. So it's a pretty common thing. 42% is a lot. These workers are disproportionately women, disproportionately Black, disproportionately Hispanic. And these jobs are likely to be in a service industry. And the service industry is a large and growing sector of our economy, and the occupations that these workers occupy are large and growing sources of employment. So this is a real challenge that we need to confront in terms of what does work pay. And nobody better talk about it with than David Rolf. So I am so happy to have David here. I was so glad to see his book and to get the chance to talk about him. For those of you who don't know David, he is organizer extraordinaire. He's organized more people into labor unions than really kind of anybody out there organizing these days. And yet, he's also one of the people who's got the most to say about, sort of, is the labor movement really going to be the answer anymore, or what needs to happen to create change? He's an incredible strategist, an incredible thinker. He's written an incredible book. And it's a book that really is, it's an important book both for sounding the alarm of what's going wrong in the world of work, but it's also a really optimistic book about how people can get engaged and really look hard at the problem and come up with new solutions. So we're really glad to have David here. Thank you, David, for joining us. And let's just start with the current state of play. So this isn't just the fight for 15. You've had some wins. So where do we have 15 and what do things look like right now?
Sure. So the first time that anyone mentioned $15 as an actual goal, it really occurred 3 times in November of 2012, so less than 4 years ago, when a group of Brooklyn fast food workers walked off on strike, about 200 people, took to the streets protesting not one specific employer, not one labor contract, but protesting poverty wages in the fast food industry, demanding $15 and a union. That same month, a colleague and collaborator of mine named Nick Hanauer gave a speech to the Democracy Alliance. I won't go into the details of how he came up with this, but he sort of got mad about something he'd heard about Democrats not being in favor of $9 or $10. And he got on stage and said to hell with it, it ought to be 15. And then, those two events were not in any way connected. And then also unconnected was the publisher of a journal called American Conservative, a California billionaire, Silicon Valley guy named Ron Unz, who had run against Pete Wilson in the California Republican primary in 1994 from the right, published an article making the conservative case for a $12 to $15 minimum wage. Those things all happened in November of 2012. By May of 2013, we'd had the first 6 strikes in the fast food sector demanding $15 and a union. I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about CTAC, but by November of 2013, the first small city had done a $15 living wage law covering 6,000 workers in the airport, airline, hospitality, and transportation sectors in CTAC, which is the airport city that serves both Seattle and Tacoma. And then Seattle became the first city to do a broad-based $15 minimum wage the following May, 1 year to the date after the first Seattle fast food strike. Today, there are 20 million Americans on a path to covered under $15 minimum wage laws, mostly, of course, in New York and California, since those 2 states adopted statewide policies, but also a number of other eastern cities, a number, both Seattle was the first large city, but then now we've got debates going on in Baltimore and in Cleveland. And a number of union contracts, even in other states, settled at $15. So Johns Hopkins, before Baltimore was considering a $15 minimum wage, settled their union contract at $15 minimums. The home care contract in Massachusetts settled at $15 minimums. Even the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is a non-union and very anti-union employer, it's also the largest private sector employer in Pennsylvania, just established a $15 internal minimum wage. So today, as a result of this work, there are now 20 million Americans and growing who live under some form of a $15 minimum wage policy. What remains, obviously, is that the demand for a union that those fast food workers articulated is still unmet. And probably won't be met in the sense that we're talking about old school 1935 era enterprise bargaining unions, but where the real aspiration isn't to replicate the worst forms of 20th century industrial policy, but rather to build a strong, stable, permanent membership organization that has the ability to force companies to say yes when they want to say no.
Yeah, great. So let's talk a little bit more about CTAC, because CTAC was really interesting in that it's not about a union, right? It was about a ballot measure, and it was about organizing sort of less within the context of a firm and more within the context as citizens of a particular community. So talk a little bit about why that was the strategy and what happened there.
Well, it really was a hybrid, because in the year 2010, at the depths of the Great Recession, an organization called Working Washington, which was essentially an SEIU labor community partnership, knocked on 100,000 doors in South Seattle and South King County to talk to working class people about what was going on in their lives. We weren't talking to them because of where they worked, whether or not they were registered to vote, even whether or not they were a citizen. We talked to 100,000 people about the economy. And one of the data points that popped up was the large number of people in these communities that were working full-time at the airport but living in poverty and depending on public assistance of some sort and struggling with often multiple jobs to make ends meet. And so originally, CTAC was in large measure a union organizing effort. There's, over the course of a generation, working class jobs at airports went from being solid middle class jobs to being poor jobs. So Congressman Adam Smith, the congressman who represents CTAC, his dad worked as a baggage handler for United Airlines in the 70s, made the equivalent of $60,000 a year in today's wages with a health plan and a pension. That's no one's idea of luxury, but it's a solid middle class job. And he was able to send his kid to college and to law school. And a generation later, whoever handles the bags for United no longer works for United. They work for one of them, many of an alphabet soup of no-name subcontractors that bid against each other in a race to the bottom on price, which then forces down labor costs. And if one company says they have to raise wages, they can easily be replaced by another. So that became the dominant economic ecosystem at most American airports, including at CTAC. And in the book, I talk about some of the workers who, a guy who was an honorably discharged U.S. Marine who did a total of 5 tours of duty in the Middle East and in Kosovo and other places, and who was commuting 45 miles a day to a minimum wage job putting fuel in jets. And when he and his coworkers showed up at the public agency, at a public hearing at a public agency to talk about their working conditions, they were forced out by security because they weren't allowed to bring hazardous materials into the boardroom. Those being the uniforms that got soaked in jet fuel doing their job. But they were told, as a condition of employment, they had to take those uniforms and launder them themselves at home. Now go home and look at your dryer and see the warning label that says don't put any gasoline or fuel soaked materials in here, right? Because it could blow up your house. So those workers started forming unions, but quickly ran against the buzzsaw of 21st century American labor law, which is since, at least since the 80s, been more of a union prevention statute than a union facilitation statute. And this is true nowhere more than in the airline industry, where significant percentages are actually covered by the Railway Labor Act, which is a 1919 statute that presumes that all of the railway engineers will meet all of the other railway engineers in stations across the country, and therefore will know each other and could form a union together. That works if you're a pilot. It works if you're a flight attendant. It does not work so well if you're a jet fueler who cannot afford to buy a ticket on a plane. And so the law essentially required, to get a union, workers to form unions at the same time with the people who work for the same companies in Honolulu and Portland, Maine. An impossible task. So workers ultimately decided to write labor standards into the law. And SeaTac, like many, many cities and states on the West Coast, has relatively easy access to the ballot. If you get a certain number of signatures on your proposed law, you can qualify for the ballot. And that's what happened in SeaTac. We qualified a ballot measure that raised wages to $15 immediately, provided for paid sick leave, required employers to offer full-time work to part-time workers before adding more part-time workers, prohibited hospitality employers from skimming off tips and pocketing them, and had a private right of action for enforcement. So essentially, some of what might have gone into a labor contract was written into law, qualified for the ballot, and won by 77 votes on Election Day in 2013. Now, you should just understand that, why is there an election in 2013? Because throughout much of the country, municipalities and even states depend on picking low turnout elections where the majorities will not vote in order to preserve the power of a local ruling elite. SeaTac is a majority person of color, majority immigrant city, governed entirely by conservative white people because they hold their primary elections in August of off years, in odd-numbered years, and typically fewer than 1 in 5 residents actually turns out to vote. That's part of what we had to change to pass the SeaTac measure, and knocked on 10,000 doors 40,000 times in order to turn out enough people to pass that measure with 77 vote margins.
Yeah, but one of the interesting things I thought in that SeaTac story was also the role of some of the small business owners in the community, and the and sort of the different the different stories ahead of time from the business community and the different stories afterwards. And so it'd be interesting to talk about that a little.
So there were two. SeaTac. If anyone's ever worked on a nursing home union organizing campaign, you will recognize that's a very obscure thing to have worked on. But if you have, you will know that on the day before the election, the workers fall into two camps. They're either wearing the union button or they're not making eye contact with the union organizer, right? And that's what SeaTac really became in the months leading up to the election. No one was neutral, and no one at the doors was neutral. We wouldn't even count you as a yes vote going door to door if you weren't willing to put a sign in your yard or put one in your window, because that was a telltale sign you weren't really with us. And the business community was sort of the same way. So on the one hand, you had what you sort of expected: the small town chamber of commerce saying, "Oh, this is going to kill us. We're all going to go out of business. We're going to lose these jobs. It's going to hurt the people you intend to help." Yada yada. All of the things, all of the myths. Charitably myths that get repeated anytime anyone talks about raising labor standards. And then you also had some other businesses that did different things. So a guy named Don Liberty runs a sports bar called the Bullpen Bar and Grill. It's about a mile south of the airport. It serves a lot of airport workers and a lot of working class residents of SeaTac who come in for a beer and a sandwich and to watch the game of their choice. And Don Liberty, who was actually a Republican, figured out that if airport workers had more money to spend, he was likely going to get more customers. And so he became a very enthusiastic public spokesperson for Proposition 1, the measure. Then you had the guy who was the general manager at the SeaTac's there's a lot of hotels in SeaTac because that's an airport city, but mostly it's the kind of hotels where you're trying to. It's not it's not luxury hotels. It's places where pilots and flight crews sleep. It's places where if you have an overnight layover, you just go across the street. It's not generally a luxury hotel town, but there's one exception. There's one luxury hotel that's used for conferences and for higher-end business travelers or people on international layovers. And the general manager of the hotel became the spokesperson against the campaign. And he would host the Vote No committee meetings in a private dining room at the hotel where they'd serve prime rib and red wine at lunch. I don't know what the Aspen Institute's doing here with these sandwiches and bottles of water.
Sorry.
Yeah. And they would talk about what was going to happen if this thing passed. And the hotel said, well, because the SeaTac measure only applied to larger employers. And so they said, well, that's it. We'll just lay off enough people so we don't qualify as a larger employer anymore. We'll cut down the number of rooms. then the guy who ran a Master Park franchise said he would replace, he was quoted in the press as saying he would replace all of his employees with kiosks. Probably the most shocking thing that got said, and it's probably not shocking to anyone here that we occasionally had good information get reported out of those committee meetings. But one time the general manager of the hotel said, you know, if this passes, I won't be able to offer my employees shift meals anymore. In other words, the free meals that restaurant workers often get before or after their shift. And someday that's the only meal they get. Okay. But there's a happy ending to the story. The Master Park franchise guy, after he threatened to replace all his employees with kiosks, after the measure passed, he hung a big sign on his fence that said, now hiring $15 an hour. Dana Milbank with the Washington Post called him and said, what's up? And he says, well, it turns out my customers actually want customer service after all. My employees are happy campers these days. Direct quote. And the hotel, the investors met right after the measure passed, and because they were going to not be earning as much ROI per room night based on increased labor costs, they decided to double the size of the hotel and add a new wing with 2 presidential suites and a spa, so that they could get more business and realize the same projections that they'd had, sort of going into to the business. So, in general, I mean, some businesses fought for 2 years through litigation. Those were the unhappy ones who now have to write tens of millions of dollars of back paychecks to make people whole for the money they didn't get when the initiative passed, because it was sustained through every court of the land and is now the law.
Great. So you go from SeaTac, which is a relatively small town, and it was, the airport is kind of dominant there, to Seattle, which is a big town, and you got a lot of different industries and a lot of different folks. So sort of contrast sort of what was different about Seattle in terms of the players and the process and sort of how that
Very
all,
different.
and you can't really knock on every single voter's door.
No, you can't. So despite being only 15 miles apart, they were a huge study in contrast. SeaTac is an inner ring suburb in decline. They'd lost their video store to become a pawn shop. Their grocery store had become a Goodwill. And good jobs, like Adam Smith's father's had in the 70s, had become bad jobs. And that was the story of SeaTac. Seattle is a boomtown. Seattle is, every day 50 new people move there, 35 new jobs are created, and only 12 new housing units are brought on the market. So we are now dealing with an upwards price spiral in housing costs that, producing the kinds of rents that people in San Francisco, but not in Honolulu maybe, but not that many other places are used to experiencing. And it's a very fast-growing city. There's a 2-year wait to lease a construction crane in downtown because there's so much new construction going on. And Seattle's an incredibly progressive city with a very strong labor history. The one general strike in U.S. history occurred in Seattle in 1919. It didn't end well for the strikers, but it did occur. And so you had this very progressive city with a strong labor tradition, combined with these incredibly, with these very strong economic growth trends that generally were benefiting those who already had the most. And you had, one of the most successful strikes in the first wave of fast food strikes. 14 restaurants actually had to shut down for the day, something that wasn't true in every city. Thousands of workers and supporters marched on May 29th and 30th of 2013. And this was happening right as the SeaTac campaign was also happening in the same media market. So although the strategies were different, in one case it was a ballot measure, in one case we were trying to get a law past city council, in one case it was strongly connected to a traditional union organizing drive, in another case to a more 21st century sort of postmodern union organizing drive in fast food. Ultimately, those two campaigns were financed by and run by the same people at the top level. But the strategy in Seattle was very different. First of all, we wanted to turn the elections, whereas SeaTac actually was a literal referendum on 15, In Seattle, we were trying to create a virtual referendum on 15. We had municipal elections that year, including a mayor, the mayor's race, and half the city council. And the coalition essentially chose to make the mayor's race a single issue election on the subject of 15. And did that by timing the strikes and the sit-ins, the boycotts, the civil disobedience, with the key the key elements, the key moments in the municipal elections. Also by doing things like having a televised debate on low-wage worker issues that every major candidate attended, and had to go on TV and explain how they would live on the state minimum wage to a live and studio or in studio and public audience. And so by the time we got to the election, which was in SeaTac, Prop 1 on the ballot, in Seattle, a mayor's race and a city council race, public opinion was already strongly with us. We didn't know quite how strongly until a little later. We only won by 77 in SeaTac, but in Seattle, a much more progressive city, it wasn't just that a pro $15 mayor got elected, which we kind of thought was going to happen. What no one saw happening was the election of a single issue city council candidate who was a member of a British-based Trotskyist party, beating a 3-term incumbent for a city council seat. And if something shook up the political establishment in Seattle, I mean, this person, her name's Shama Sawant. She's now sort of famous. You see her on TV because she's the only, I think pretty much the only socialist holding any major office in the U.S. And no one saw that coming. Like, it wasn't even the far left of the labor movement didn't support her campaign. It was everyone sort of figured the Democrat would prevail, and so it was sort of a shock to the system. And so when marchers marched 15 miles in December from SeaTac to Seattle to symbolically bring the $15 minimum wage fight from one city to the next, half the city council was there with handing out cookies and tea when marchers approached City Hall Plaza. And that became, listen, it was not all kumbaya for the next 4 months, but the mayor had pledged, if elected, to appoint a citizen task force, a stakeholder task force, really, to negotiate how to get to 15. And so I was the co-chair, and along with a guy who's a very prominent business leader in Seattle, whose family owns the Space Needle and who owns the Sheraton Hotel and a bunch of hospitality businesses, and a large employer of low-wage workers. And a task force of 24 people essentially spent 4 months negotiating in what felt very much like collective bargaining. It just wasn't between one employer and one union. It was between all the employers and all the unions, and a number of community organizations and political stakeholder groups as well. And the posture of the business community was quite different, because they'd seen what happened in SeaTac, they'd seen what happened with the city council and mayoral election, and the Seattle business community, which is, our Chamber of Commerce famously disaffiliated from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce because they didn't like their politics. And so, it's still a chamber, but they negotiated in good faith. And for 4 months, we, spent our evenings and weekends in City Hall bargaining what would be the parameters of the $15 wage policy that was then ultimately supported by 21 of the 24 members of the commission and by a unanimous vote of City Council.
Great. So I want to switch a little too. Because so those have been a couple good environments to get some of the things done. But you sort of pass a law, and then there's enforcing it. And in 2015, the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division brought in over $246 million in back wages for over 240,000 workers. We have challenges with compliance with current labor law. I'm glad to see Sharon Block here today. And we know resources also for enforcement are limited, right? So that's an issue. So are you seeing both challenges, as it spreads to other jurisdictions? What are your concerns about enforcement, and are you seeing anybody think about what are some innovative sort of strategies that can use resources well?
Yeah. So prior to passing a $15 minimum wage law, Seattle had actually passed a criminal anti-wage theft statute. And back in the summer of 2013, when we were doing the fast food strikes, one of the things one of the specific protests that we conducted was a protest over the fact that 3 years after the wage theft law had passed, no one had actually been prosecuted under it. Now, that either means that every fast food employer, every call center, every residential construction contractor, every janitorial firm operating in Seattle is completely unlike all of the others that operate everywhere else, or it means that we weren't enforcing the law very well. And it turns out what we had was a complaint-based top-down enforcement system that would require workers to walk into a police station with a documented case in order to get any charges brought. Now, if you've met any fast food workers, or any janitors, or many call center employees, or domestic workers, or residential construction workers, what do you think the chances of someone who's not working with papers want to walk into a police station to complain about their employer are? Right? Approximately zero. And what do you think then the chances that they've done contemporaneous documentation, lined up their witnesses, have their pay stubs all here, like none, right? So even when we had skilled union representatives assist workers with the filing of cases, we really couldn't get the police to take them because they sort of said, this isn't our job. What do you want? You want a claim number for your insurance policy? Great. Like if you had your car prowled or something. But, and this has been a common problem, right? Is that top-down complaint-based systems tend to enforce the law only in sectors which are both high violation and high complaint. Law firms and academic departments are notoriously low violation, high complaint. Right? If you looked at the EEOC caseload, you would quickly conclude that sociologists were among the most discriminated against people in the country, and that fast food workers weren't. Guess what? Sociologists are aware of the EEOC and aware of how to file complaints at a far greater rate than fast food workers are. So what I think the emerging practice is that the two very important principles in enforcement are co-enforcement, which is where worker organizations and community organizations are given a role in education, outreach, navigation, case management, and legal clinic work on behalf of low-wage workers, and the principle of directed investigations, where enforcement agencies proactively look at businesses in high violation sectors. It's just like, for example, why the IRS might want to audit Donald Trump and might not want to audit, I don't know, Howard Croft or Chris Chafe or, Tanika Aiden. Right? The facts of the matter suggest that there's probably more to find if you audit Donald Trump. If you were going to look in Seattle at where to look for violations, you would probably want to look in kitchens before you would want to look in biopharma laboratories, hypothetically. So those are the two principles. One is to actually empower low-wage workers and people in their communities to be agents of enforcement, not literally handing out tickets or issuing fines, but to educate workers to be able to do like peer-to-peer work on knowing your rights, on knowing how to access enforcement, including through trusted community organizations. And so that's an important strategy that we're using in Seattle, and San Francisco uses, I think, an earlier variation on it. You can see it at work in the pure private sector in places like the Maintenance Cooperation Trust Fund in the California janitorial industry, or the Coalition of Immobility Workers in the Florida tomato fields, or the Workers' Defense Project in the Austin construction industry. And that's where essentially it's a bottom-up enforcement. And a restaurant owner, a friend of mine explained this to me very well. He said, well, my guys don't take any crap. And if I go and ask them to do something that I don't think they ought to do, they're going to tell me about it. Well, that's perfect, because that means there's never a complaint because there's never a violation, right? Then the second principle is this idea that you go where, if there's smoke, there may be fire, so go where the smoke is. If you were running a fire department, you would not equally send fire crews to every building or to random buildings. You would presumably send ones to buildings where there was smoke coming out of them. And so those are the two things on enforcement, I think, that are emerging best practices.
Okay, so I have two more questions for you that we're going to try to make a little quick. But I just want to sort of extend from, because I could talk to you all day, but I know we have more to do here. And I actually wanted to ask this trust question, right? So one, it's been commented that the U.S. sort of lacks. Actually, Anne-Marie Slaughter said this this past summer at the Ideas Festival, right? We don't have a labor party in the U.S. There's not really a party that represents workers. And then I look, and the Edelman Trust Index is showing sort of this big divide in terms of trust in institutions, in government, in business, in the media, in nonprofit organizations. There's a big difference between sort of what they call the informed public, which is basically people who earn in the top 25% and have gone to college and who are regular readers of newspapers, and what they call the mass population in terms of their trust in institutions. And the U.S. is the highest among developed countries, with a 31 percentage point gap in trust among those two groups. Have you found this lack of trust in the workers that you're organizing, and how they feel about institutions? I mean, even maybe how they feel about unions and their trust within unions. And do you think some of the things that you've been engaged in terms of better enforcement of laws and getting their voices heard in elections and getting their voices heard through ballot measures, do you think that can help rebuild trust?
Yeah, trust has to be earned. And if most American workers no longer have trust in our major institutions, it's likely because those institutions let down American workers. Right? We've experienced a 40-year freeze in wages. We saw over a generation healthcare costs transferred systematically away from companies and governments. Now, I mean, there's a change now with Obamacare, but for a period of decades, healthcare costs transferred onto individual consumers. We replaced student grants with student loans and made debt-free college education a thing of the past. We imported third world wages, outsourced manufacturing, we privatized, globalized, detaxed, deunionized, we got rid of pensions in the private sector, which means that the average American 55 years or older has only enough retirement savings to pay for $100 of post-retirement, $100 a month of post-retirement income. We replaced old Jim Crow laws with new economic apartheid for black and brown America, meaning that most African American and Latino families are 2 paychecks away from bankruptcy. And we said that that when women doubled their workforce participation between 1977 and 2012 from 37 to 74%, the net take-home pay for the bottom 90% of income-earning families would be $0. I wouldn't trust the people who did that to me either. And so I think that if there's a lack of trust in major institutions amongst American workers, it's a well-earned lack of trust, because we went from an arc of history that actually always through struggle made life better for workers every generation for 200 years, to throwing the whole thing into reverse. Now, I do think that my experience as a union organizer is that people who actually, and I'm sure Tanika will talk about this when she's up here, that once people have experience of taking action and winning and making change, it's an incredibly empowering experience. And I think it's much easier to trust in institutions that you have an experience of helping to change and helping to steer. I think in a democracy, no one should expect that they're going to be the only ones steering major institutions, but having the experience of having decisions you make and actions you take together with coworkers or people in your community have an impact is definitely something that creates a feeling of ownership in the broader societal institutions.
Great. And the last question is just, in the book, and we talked about even how it didn't work out so badly for the businesses at CTAC, but there's always this, somehow the sky's going to fall if we raise wages to $15 an hour. And so often this conversation revolves around like it's going to kill jobs and businesses can't survive. But it rarely seems to say, well, how will workers and how will families survive if we don't raise wages? So I guess my question for you is to what degree does anybody else ever ask the question, well, what happens if we don't raise wages? And what's the fallout there economically, politically, socially, if we can't manage to raise wages?
I talk a lot about this in the book, and if people want to jump to chapter 7, which is kind of the rebuttal of all the arguments against minimum wages, feel free. In the head of the department store trade association predicted that if Congress passed a law prohibiting children under 16 from working more than 8 hours a day, that all department stores would go bankrupt. That prediction was made in 1913. Now, one can imagine a world of the future where all department stores go bankrupt. It will have far more to do with e-commerce and Amazon than it will do because of child labor laws. In 1937, when Congress was passing its first federal minimum wage, the head of the American Publishers Association demonstrated his ignorance of both economics and classical history by predicting that America would fall like ancient Rome if we, like ancient Rome, got into the business of dictating prices in the private sector. Oh, that's why ancient Rome. There are a set of specific myths. I call them, I think in some cases lies, but myths, that minimum wage increases cost jobs, make businesses close or relocate, and hurt the people they're intended to help. Those have been repeated now so often, like all the other parts of trickle-down economics, that one believes, or is led to believe, they're written into the founding documents of the country. The problem is it's totally wrong. And if you look at every minimum wage increase that's happened in US history, the correlation they tend to correlate more with periods of growing employment than with shrinking employment. If you look at specific states and cities and compare them to surrounding states and cities, in actual, not in theory, but in actual practice, you see things like most of the time when a city raises its minimum wage, its employment and its wages grow faster than its surrounding areas, not the other way around. Or that if a border town, like say Trenton and Philadelphia, or Spokane and Coeur d'Alene, one state raises the minimum wage, the other holds it steady. Do businesses cross the line? No, workers cross the line. It's a lot easier. So what happens when you don't raise the minimum wage? I think we see, right? With 40 years of wage stagnation in America, we saw depressed levels of consumer spending, slow economic growth, more frequent recessions that were more structural in their nature, and not just people like me, but people like, or institutions like Standard & Poor's, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank have all issued reports in the last 4 years pointing to America's high relative rates of poverty, low relative wages, low levels of intergenerational social mobility as reasons for slow and inconsistent economic growth and as long-term threats to our economy. One can sort of think about Japan and Germany because they're an interesting case study. They were both occupied by American armed forces after the Second World War, and American generals functionally played the role as the dictator of the country. General MacArthur imposed on Japan an American-style enterprise bargaining system that meant one union, one company at the smallest possible worksite level to bargain labor standards, and without any sort of regional or sectoral bargaining power. And that's what they did in Japan. Eisenhower, meanwhile, helped the Germans resurrect a somewhat older system of regional and sectoral bargaining that set minimums throughout all people who worked for a type of employer within a geographic region. Today, Germany has the world's largest middle class. We are number 27. Japan is in the fourth decade of a recession. So who would you rather be? Would you rather be Germany with a high wage, a growing middle class? And by the way, even though their automobile workers make twice what ours do, they manufacture and sell twice as many cars. So the problem is ultimately not that they have broadly shared prosperity, a stable and growing middle class, and healthy unions. Germany has proved, when Angela Merkel was asked why she opposed a minimum wage for Germany, she said, we don't need it, we have collective bargaining. So I think it comes down to which would you rather be. We have so far made a choice. We want to be more like Japan, with weaker social programs, weaker wages, weaker unions, and a smaller middle class. And the 40-year war on the American middle class has in fact paid off well for those who financed it, because the rich in fact got richer. The percentage of GDP harvested by the top 1% of the top 10% grew while the middle class shrank, and for the first time ever is no longer the largest economic class in America. And we went from having the world's largest to the world's 27th largest middle class. So I think we have to make a choice. Do we like the path we've been on for 40 years? Because if we think we would have voted for that in 1976, let's keep doing it. And let's keep shrinking the middle class, hurting workers, shrinking wages, eroding benefits, getting rid of social safety programs, and moving more and more people into your on-the-own economy. The problem is there's only so many yachts you can sell to rich people, and as Nick Hanauer points out, billionaires only need the same number of pants as everybody else. So if ultimately you depend on making, transporting, or selling a good or a service to someone who doesn't only need to buy private jets and yachts, then the consumer demand side, which is 70% of the American economy, is going to hurt without some upward stimulus.
Great. Thank you. All right. We are Great. So now we get a chance to chat with some people who, as I mentioned before, for these find these issues most immediate. So right next to me, I'm going to try to say names properly, is Ridwan Ahmed Gele. Oh, thank you. Who is an airport worker. Next to Ridwan is Crystal Thompson, fast food worker and mother, and a member of Working Washington. And next to Crystal is Tanika Aiden, a home care worker and a board member of SEIU 775. So thank you all for being with us here today. And first, I just was hoping you could tell everybody sort of briefly about your job, where you work, kind of a little about what you do and how long you've been doing it. And Tanika, let's start with you and just kind of work down.
All right. Well, good morning. First off, thank you, Aspen Institute, for asking me to be here. And definitely thank you to my president, David Rolf, who's done so much for home care workers in Washington State and Montana. And my name's Tanika Aiden. I have been a home care worker for 15 years. So home care workers, we go into people's homes who are disabled in some type of way, who need a little bit of extra help. Say like a war vet who lost a limb, we go in and help them live their day-to-day lives so they can stay at home as long as possible. So I originally went to school I got my degree in communications, and then the economy fell out, so the type of jobs I was looking for I wasn't able to get into. Most home care workers don't start out with the goal of being in home care. But around the same time, a family member of mine, their health declined. So I went into home care work. It was very hard at that time to find a home care worker because of the way home care was set up in Washington State. So I got into that. And I actually became an activist. Originally, when I was in college, I was working at a department store. I was a member of a union. It was a very bad experience. So I didn't want anything to do with the labor movement at all. So all this stuff was going on at the same time. When I started being a home care worker, the workers were organizing to form a union. I wanted nothing to do with that because of my bad experience. But they formed the union, and things started to really improve for home care workers. I didn't really know how that was happening, but I thought it was great. So when they came back to me 8 years later and wanted to talk to me about the union, I was a little more receptive. And so that's how I got in. They invited me. Once I got in there and saw the way that people who take care of our most vulnerable were being treated, I wanted to do something about it. And I started traveling and talking to other low-wage workers and letting them know how they can get out of their situation.
Great. Thank you. Crystal?
First off, I would like to thank the Aspen Institute for inviting us here, and David Rolf for empowering us workers and starting the fight for 15. Without him, none of this would have been possible. My name is Crystal Thompson. I'm a single mother of 3 wonderful boys. I was born and raised in Seattle, and I've worked at Domino's Pizza for the past 7 years. I'm also involved in Working Washington. We helped set and organize the fast food and coffee retail workers strike in the city. And we've also been to Olympia, it's the capital of Washington, and we've also spoke with legislators and city council members and shared our stories.
Great. Thank you. Ridwan.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, thank you all of you. This is my first time to come to Washington, D.C. So it's nice.
It's okay.
Yeah. And thank you for David. Also, Union Institute. All people are come attending for this meeting. My name is Ridwan Gele. I was born in Somalia. I came from Somalia in 2009. I started my career in 2009 in Dallas, Texas. I moved up in Washington, SeaTac in 2013. So I worked SeaTac Airport, Air Service Interline Battery Center. So I've been working at that place since 2018. And it's wonderful.
Great. So tell me, and I'll sort of go the other way this time. So Ridwan, when did you get involved with sort of trying to advocate for change in your workplace, and what inspired you to get involved in sort of the vote for yes?
Yes, I get involved when I met for organizer who's working for this movement. I see a lot of co-workers on my team are struggling their life basically inside, I see the companies making more money. They have more profit while the employees are struggling for inside. So that will be pushing me to get involved for this movement. So I go door by door. I do for phone calls. I meet my community, my people, my family to say, come and vote for yes. And I see that time it was great time to make people therefore to change that situation. So people are getting like minimum wage, which not affect, they cannot pay their bills. And Washington is one of high standard basic life in US. So I was sharing for emotional story for my workers, and they have no time to get their families because of their billing. The jobs are not fit for to get his family and to get his job, which is basically everybody like to get work and to take for his family. So that was me pushing me to take for this movement.
Great. Crystal, what connected you to Working Washington, and yeah, why did you get involved with that?
Well, initially, a Working Washington organizer had came to our job and was asking for signatures, and was also talking to us about a meeting about the minimum wage and invited us. So I thought it sounded kind of interesting, so I went, and then we started. The first thing we got into, we did the wage stuff, protest, and we did some boycotts, and then from there it led to the fight for 15 and trying to raise the minimum wage, and it's a struggle. I mean, I've had the same job for 7 years and not getting a raise, only when the minimum wage went up, and just watching, my family and coworkers struggle, trying to make ends meet and raise their families.
Yeah, and can you say a little, because we were talking earlier, when they first asked you to participate in a strike or something, how did that feel?
I was really scared. I didn't want to lose my job, and I wasn't very informed of my rights. And the second time we went out, I believe there was a lawyer that came and spoke to us workers and informed us of our rights and stuff, and let us know that we would not lose our jobs if we went out on strike. And so I went out on the second and the third strike.
Yeah, great. Great. And Tanika, you already talked a little bit about, sort of your good and bad experiences with union and what connected you back to SEIU. But maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of what that's meant for you and sort of how that's changed your workplace. And also just, have you found that any of your work in this way has gotten an interesting reaction from any of your coworkers or family members or other people about sort of your involvement with the union?
Yeah, well, I mean, growing up, I heard about, if you work hard, you can have this American dream, you can have your piece of the American dream. But, looking around, I was seeing, a lot of home care workers are working 65 hours a week just to be broke and still can't pay bills. I see a lot of people with health conditions who can't even afford any kind of medical help, can't afford to go to the doctor, can't afford medications, working 2 jobs. I know a lot of people who have to make that decision every day on whether or not to pay their bills or whether to eat, So, but yet it's been proven that America is making more money today than we've ever made before. So it kind of got me thinking, where are all those wages going? Why are there so many people out here struggling? So what really kind of inspired me to get involved was the fact that that's not right. The wealth is there. We should, share in that wealth like we did back in the day, when we had a big labor movement. Everyone shared in the wealth. And, because I think that all people should have respect and dignity on their job and be able to pay the necessities. One instance I can remember when I first, got active, I went on a campaign out in California, and I was working with a group of workers who were just trying to form a union just to have the basics. I mean, the living wage was insanely low, and this is California. It costs like $50 to get a piece of gum there. So, but one of the very first houses I went to, there was, the level of poverty there was surprising to me. I'm a military brat, I was shielded from a lot of stuff. I didn't grow up in extreme poverty, and there was a woman there. Her husband had died. She had 6 children, and she was taking care of his mother, working as a home care worker and then doing fast food. And they were living in a studio apartment, and the smell, just the whole situation made me upset enough to be like, this is not right. Everyone, you guys, we got to stand up and change this. This is not right. And when I first got involved in the union, people didn't know what I was doing. Like, why are you doing that? It doesn't really affect you. You're only in home care part-time. Those people don't have anything to do with you. But, I can't just sit by and let someone in that situation be like that, just work themselves to death, knowing that they can change their situation. Just especially in Washington, seeing what has changed. Kind of like David said, once we get you in there and you see what's going on, you really just can't sit there and not do anything. So that was just getting out and talking to the workers really is what inspired me to do what I do.
Yeah, great. Okay, we're going to ask one last question, and then we'll have David come on back up so we can have some conversation with you all. But just briefly, is there one thing that you think the audience here, one more thing that you think that you haven't mentioned yet, that you think the audience here should understand either about your job or about your work to advocate for change in workplaces like yours? And Ridwan, I'll just start with you, and we can just go down the line.
Okay. I would like to see that we continue this kind of movement until we see all the workers to change their life and to get what they deserve it. Mm-hmm. I like to continue. I like to see everybody get what you deserve to get it. And if possible, I would like to see this movement will come internationally. If they go for another continent, another country, something like that. That's what I'm sharing for the audience.
I believe that all workers deserve to make a living wage. All working people should be able to afford to live and raise their family in the city where they work and not have to rely on public assistance. We all have a voice, and workers need to be informed of their rights. We need to keep the fight up and make it grow. We need to try to get the minimum wage up for the whole country, I believe.
Great. And Tanika?
So I remember when the Fight for 15 first started, I had a lot of people come up and say, why should we pay those fast food workers? They're just flipping burgers, right? They're just delivering pizza. Why should they get a living wage? And I was kind of like that too. I'm like, 15, that might be a little bit too much. But when you really think about it, I'm out here advocating for low-wage workers to stand up for themselves and get living wages. They work just as hard as anybody else. It shouldn't matter if you're an airport worker or you work at a hospital. It doesn't matter if you're a home care aide or you're a nurse. It doesn't matter if you work in fast food. All people, like my sister Crystal here said, should have dignity and respect on the job and should be able to still have that American dream. I still believe in the American dream, so I just think that all workers deserve that dignity and respect. And I was at a conference a couple days ago where I got to hear from a leader in the movement. His name is Terrence Wise. And he was talking about how the CEO of McDonald's makes $9,000 an hour. And he has been in fast food for over 10 years. He works 2 low-wage jobs and barely makes minimum wage, can barely pay his bills. When we have inequality like that in our nation, something has to change. There's enough wealth for all of us out here, and we should all share in it. There shouldn't be, the workers who are actually making the work not being able to pay their bills while CEOs make that much money. They can still have a whole bunch of money, and their workers can still have some money too, and we could all share in the dream.
Yeah. Great. Okay, we're going to ask David to come on back up here, and if you want to raise your hand, we do have some mics to be passed, so we can try to get a mic to whoever would like to ask the first question over there. And please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Dan Morrissey with the Peace Island Federal Credit Union. My question is, in areas where one would expect tax revenues to go up as well. Is that actually happening? So, in other words, an economic benefit for the jurisdictions that have this.
Yeah, you would expect that. I don't have any data on it. So maybe someone else in the room does, because that was not, it was something I predicted would happen in my book, and it was something that Ron Unz predicted would happen when he wrote his article back in 2012, and he sort of said, the conservative case for a higher minimum wage is raises tax revenue without raising marginal tax rates, lowers dependence on government programs, and provides more stimulus, a bit more customers for business. But I haven't actually seen real-time data on what's happened so far in the earliest cities that have done significant increases. So in other words, Seattle, San Francisco, LA, perhaps simply because, even as we speak today, the New York and California laws are less than a year old. Right? So the answer is really, I don't know, but I don't know if someone here from one of the great research institutions that we work with, like NELP or EPI or CPB or CAP or Roosevelt, maybe should take that on and figure out the answer.
So my name is Eddie Eichis, and I'm an officer in American Federation of Government Employees, a union, federal workers. And the whole sheet of paper, on at least the front of Fight for 15, has only one even mention of unionism, and it says looking beyond traditional unionism. And my question concerns, of course we do it too in the AFL-CIO, we have now working in America, we have all types of mechanisms to try to raise the minimum wage, but we have really no way of financing these movements because a lot of these movements do not end up in traditional unionism. And so my first question is that. My second question is that almost all of these the movement successes are in states that are not right to work for less states. And I'm wondering whether these movements even exist in Mississippi or Texas or other places like that.
Yeah, great questions. So I went to see Andy Grove once when he was still alive, long after he retired. And I sort of said, here's our problem. Our problem is that we've got declining rates of overall unionization, and for a whole number of reasons, which probably are far too complex to get into. I think this was the subject of an entire other talk I did on this stage at one other point a couple years ago. But for reasons that are complex, no likelihood that America's 1935 era collective bargaining law is going to resurrect itself and result in strong unions again in the way that my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my mother all had strong unions. And that would be fine, except that there's no democratic capitalism on earth that's built and sustained a middle class or even a democracy itself without some form of a robust labor movement. And Andy Grove said, I'm not arrogant enough to think I can solve this problem for you, which is not what you want to hear from the founder of Silicon Valley. But he said, I have two pieces of advice. One is that really you have to think about your outcomes very rigorously, and think about you have to get used to not thinking about current organizations or businesses, structures, leaders, laws, practices, or strategies. And just figure out how to isolate your outcomes and solve backwards from that. And if that means having to cast aside all that is comfortable and familiar, then that's where you have to go. And the second thing he said is, I have a suspicion you're going to end up needing to fund the projects that everyone else wants to bury. And those turned out to be, I think, very wise. Turned out to be very wise counsel. As I sat in bad traffic for 3 hours between Palo Alto and Berkeley after the meeting, I puzzled through what are the outcomes we care about? Well, the truth is that when unions did their job well, in my great-grandfather's day and my grandfather's day and my mother's day, they were powerful enough to raise wages and benefits faster than the rate of inflation. Right? So it helped, on balance, helped create a middle class. Number two, they were large enough to touch tens of millions of Americans directly or indirectly. Right? Even though, for example, famously, IBM would just wait for General Electric to settle their union contract. They'd offer a nickel more as the non-union premium. So a bunch of unions were in effect bargaining for IBM workers, even if IBM was never signed a contract. And then thirdly, they had a revenue source, the issue you raise, that was not, at least not immediately dependent upon philanthropy or government. Now, today, unions are no longer powerful enough to raise wages in most sectors of the economy. They no longer touch tens of millions of people, and our revenue source has been revealed to be very fragile. Right to work laws can do certain things. Republican governors like Scott Walker can do other things. And this is in part because we built a very fragile enterprise-based system in America. We don't have good labor laws, and we don't have great unions. Because we have a system that is optimized for the industrial economy of 1935. It rewards fighting over crumbs rather than systemic change. It rewards low-level conflict rather than high-level collaboration. And that's why we are more like Japan than like Germany in our system of industrial relations. I don't think it has to be this way, but I think that all of the labor movement resources that are going into trying to bring back the good old days are throwing good money after bad. And what we instead ought to be doing is trying to figure out the next set of platforms or experiments. And I don't pretend we have the answers yet. What I can say is that somewhere in the country or in history or around the world, workers' organizations have engaged in regional and sectoral bargaining. They've engaged in benefit administration. They've engaged in work distribution. They've engaged in worker ownership strategies, in co-determination strategies, in labeling, certification, and standard setting, standard enforcement strategies, in addition to enterprise bargaining strategies. So anytime you take 6 of the most obvious and widely practiced forms of worker power off the table for an entire labor movement, you're going to be weakening its prospects and its possibilities. And we also only have one revenue source, which is collective agreements with employers who agree to deduct dues. And we don't have any other revenue sources, which also makes us anomalous amongst other labor unions globally. So I think that it's unlikely that most of today's unions survive. Our collective bargaining system of 1935 will almost certainly not survive. And if we want to have an American dream and a middle class, we better figure out what replaces them.
Okay. Yes.
I'm curious from a political perspective whether your organization, others like it, and your participants are actively supporting Hillary as opposed to the Donald in light of their various views, and and if so, should there be more that's being done in order to ensure protection of your activities and organizations?
Okay, I want to take another question just so that we can make sure we get plenty of questions in.
He had an unanswered one, I'm sorry. I forgot you had a second one too. So.
Sure. Hi, Christopher Gaber. I'm a reporter at Associated Press and was looking at a story on impact of education and how that's changed in our economy. And one thing I noticed was interesting fact that neither college or high school educated workers are necessarily likely to be in a union, but at this point a college educated worker is twice as likely to be a union member as a high school educated, which could reflect changes in public sector and so forth. But is there anything else that you see beyond that in terms of how the status of high school educated, college educated, how does that change and how that might impact their likelihood to be in a union or to join you in your recruitment?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So I thought I saw one more hand right back there.
Good evening. My name is James Rolf from SEIU 1199. And what I did not hear is about our educational piece for the fight for 15. We have a problem where sometimes we tell people that $15 will raise people out of poverty. But there should be a step or a movement to educate people how to change their lifestyle. Because $15 alone, without changing the behavior, will not lift anybody out of poverty. Because for as long as I can remember, my father's a union member person also, you cannot just throw money at poverty. We've been doing this since people have been walking around. So what we've been doing in Baltimore through nursing homes is have an educational piece, how to get your credit scores in check, how to do sit-down meals, how to buy in bulk, because of the importance of getting your credit score, then you could buy a house instead of paying high rent. You can do those particular things. But just promising people that $15 will get you out of poverty, and I don't want to make the mistake that people get mad at unions.
Okay. Okay, so we have the current president. Oh, okay. You want to add your question?
I thought
Okay.
I saw one more, but maybe not. No.
No. Amy, do you want to add your question? Okay. All right, we'll come back. So we have the current presidential election. We have a question on the education status of union versus non-union members, and then we have a question about worker education, and that $15 by itself isn't enough. People need to know sort of basically how to manage their money. And any of you all can comment on these questions too. I just want to say, if you would like to jump in at some point, please do. Do you want? All right, David, you start. They're going to have you answer all the questions.
The gentleman in the front row also had asked about experiments in right-to-work states. So I'll try to do all of these quickly. I think that the education status, it really is about public versus private sector. That the private sector unionism has crashed from close to 40% to close to 7%, just under 7% of the private sector workforce, while public sector unionization has remained relatively steady. And in general, public employees do things like they're social workers, they're transportation engineers, they're correction officers, they are eligibility workers, they hold a wide variety of jobs, they're healthcare professionals that on balance tilt more towards college-educated professions than not, whereas the majority of private sector union members traditionally have been high school or military educated production workers and or construction workers who got their skills through a union apprenticeship program. And so generally speaking, you're looking at two different eras of unionization and two different sectors of the economy, which I think probably explains most of that disparity. I don't think anyone would, James, I don't think anyone would say that 15 is the only solution. We need to do a lot about jobs. We need to do a lot about rewriting the employment contract so it's relevant in the 21st century, the social contract so it's updated for the 21st century. I mean, most women now work outside the home, and we never even had a national conversation about child care, elder care, or family leave. I mean, how insane is that, right? So you sort of look at the set of policies and the set of structural supports for workers and working class communities. Wages is just the low-hanging fruit. Then everything from the way the banking system works, the way the elections are financed, to the criminal justice system, to immigration reform, would all need to go into a package. If you really wanted to solve for the permanent creation of a robust and powerful middle class, wage is just the easiest thing to do. Trump versus Hillary, yes. SEIU is putting a ton of resources, people, door knockers, phone callers, volunteers, staff, all over, in all the swing states, not all over the country, because they wouldn't do much good in either Washington or Montana, where I hang my shingle. But in general, SEIU specifically, and the labor movement more broadly, is, I said on a different stage the other day, I'm sick of hearing every 4 years someone says this is the most important, or every 2 years this is the most important election of our lifetime, and I'm really, really sick of hearing that every 2 years, but this time it's actually true.
Montana has a current governor who supports you guys.
Yes, he does.
And I just wonder whether you're doing what you can in Montana.
Of course we are. Steve Bullock is a good friend of workers in the labor movement and a great governor. I think he's going to win re-election.
Okay.
You're right.
Yeah.
Last question?
And then
you
on
have
the
one
right
more,
to work,
sorry.
and then on the right to work question, there's only one large union that's actually figured out not only how to survive but how to truly prosper in a right to work environment, and that's the Culinary Local 226 of Unite here in Las Vegas. And they do that. First of all, Las Vegas is a very specific economy you couldn't replicate specifically anywhere else. Secondly, They have control of the workforce supply. In other words, they're engaging in one of these other strategies beyond mere enterprise bargaining that allows them to win over the hearts and minds of workers at a very early stage in their career, and to be incredibly value added to the employers by being able to provide skilled, trained workers for hiring. But there are two other experiments in right-to-work states that aren't being done by unions that I think are really important to look at. One is the coalition of immobility workers in the Florida tomato fields. This is an industry where there was slavery a decade and a half ago, where rape was common at the workplace, where wage theft was predominant, where people would have their immigration papers stuck in a safe by the employer. They'd live in bunk beds in metal canisters or trailer homes, and they wouldn't get paid for their work. But a decade and a half later, Walmart began paying $10 an hour to the tomato pickers who work for growers and have no direct relationship to Walmart, before Walmart was paying $9 to its own associates, because of the work of this organization called the Coalition of Immobility Workers, that used a non-collective bargaining form of worker power through purchaser pressure and boycotts to incentivize the upstream purchasers of tomatoes to insist on a fair food label for their tomatoes that could only be gotten if the growers not only adhered to certain standards that were set by a workers' organization, but actually then paid an arm of the workers' organization to come onto the job site, verify the standards are being adhered to, and educate the workers. Something very similar is now happening in the Austin and Houston construction industries, being led by the Workers' Defense Project, which has got a Better Builders program, sort of modeled off of the Fair Foods program. And these are two examples of places where where the politics of the state don't let you use government to help you because the governments are red and anti-union, and where, so they're not favorable labor laws or labor policies. Traditional strike activities are useless in these very porous, uncredentialed labor markets. You don't need a special license to pick tomatoes. And in Texas, you don't really need anything special to work in the construction industry, where they don't even require workers' compensation insurance, because that's the kind of place it is. But they nevertheless have begun to figure out how to raise standards, how to exercise power, and how to get paid for doing it through a non-collective bargaining market-based mechanism. I think those are very important signals from the future.
Great. I'm sorry. That's okay. I'm sorry. We are actually at time, and I just wanted to say a couple of things that I didn't say before. One, since he's mentioned the Coalition of Immobility Workers and Nick Hanner and Ron Unz a couple of times, I want to say Nick Hanner and Ron Unz talked about minimum wage in our very first Working in America session in March of 2013. We also did host the Coalition of Immobility Workers last fall. And you can find all of our previous sessions on our website, as.pn/workinginamerica. Please take a look, and please stick around, buy a book, sign a book, chat some more, but I think we have to close the formal part. And please join me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation.